Hello, 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 my Hope More family. My name is Hope Dents, and I'm the Chief Elevation Officer of Hope More. And I just am so grateful that the timing of God is amazing. This past month, I've been dealing with the appetite of America towards violence. And although I have very little practical answers for every issue, I wanted to ask questions because sometimes it's the conversation that gets lost in emotions and just volatility and polarization. But I just wanted and have been trying to think of foundational questions to ask and some of the things that show our appetite. So the first week I dealt with a lot of the mass shooting issues using automatic rifles or assault rifles. And I asked, why do we need the AR-15? Like, why do we need it? The second week, I dealt with the fact that we often ignore male victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Why is it that we do that? Because they are actually people in situations where the male is being battered by a female partner or just another person in the workplace, another person in the workplace. Then on the third week, I dealt with murdering yourself, suicide. And that was very, very tricky. But I wanted to ask, like, why would you murder yourself? Why would you do violence against your own being? Now, last week blew my mind. I dealt with abortion and the idea of abortion violence, or wanted to like look at abortion in the state of intentional abortion and terminating pregnancy. And my question is like, well, is abortion killing? I guess the follow up is, and if it is, what is it killing? If it's a human being, is it alive? And so I talked a lot just on the basis of that. Although we got into legality and morality, but not like whether it was moral or whether it should be legal, but let's just be honest on the brass taxes. Is it killing? So I didn't have any idea that after having that show on Wednesday, that Friday, that we would hear the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the U.S. Supreme Court. I had no idea. And so that's been really, really, really like earth shaking. And it actually gave me a little bit of belief that, okay, Lord, I may be hearing from you, especially because I'm doing the month of June without any other people to interview. And I'm like, this feels more like a podcast, an unedited podcast with a camera. But I was like, okay, that was timely. I didn't realize at the time I determined to do those four topics that we would have a fifth Wednesday. So I was like, what am I going to deal with? And I was encouraged and inspired by looking at the January 6th hearings dealing with the insurrection on the U.S. state capitol, January 6, 2021, when it came to the day that Congress was to receive the electoral college votes. And so I thought, let me deal with protests. Okay, what and how do protests turn violent? And that is inspiring my topic today. So I need you to come on because we have a lot to talk about. I would love to have you comment and share below if you have anything you want to share. And I would love also to just hear just your general thoughts on this question, which is why do protests turn violent or turn to riots? Why protests turn to riots? Why protests turn to riots? Because we have a huge issue in this nation where, especially during the pandemic, where so many protests that started off non-violent or peaceful, as they would say, turned into rioting and looting and violence. And then we have January 6th, which we have people calling the people who stormed the Capitol rioters and insurrectionists. So I wanted to deal with that. But I just wanted to also remind anyone that's watching that this Hope More is a Christian countercultural show where we deal with modern day issues. And it's not Jesus, Jesus all the time, but the goal is to uphold justice, to lift families, and share light. So my prayer is that not only is God honored at the end of our conversation, it's never too much to ask a question, never wrong to say I don't know the answer, never, I don't believe, harmful to have a conversation. I have a conversation. So what I wanted to do in starting off is make sure that you join the conversation. A lot of people, majority of my audience watches on replay. Please put in your comments. I do look at them and I appreciate your support. And also, if you would right now spread the love, share this episode on your social media with groups or pages that you can conform to the rules. Please like this page if you're on Facebook, and if you're on my YouTube channel, please click the bell so that you will get noticed when we come on. And that's Hope More, lowercase HOPE, uppercase MORE. And that's done purposely as one word in that fashion, because you only need a little bit of hope to expect more out of life. Sometimes people really think like things can't change unless you have this strategy, goals, and you just know everything is going to happen. No, just hope that the next second, the next moment, the next hour, the next day is going to be better. You can do more. So please join the conversation, spread the love, share. In fact, I'm going to take my phone right now and share it to my page, because sometimes I don't do that as fast as I should. Okay, share. Thank you so much for sharing. So let's get to the topic. We're going to be dealing with America's appetite for violence and riots. And I hope that today, when I end, that I've helped broaden the conversation, maybe equipped you in your conversations with friends when it comes to protests. And I think even hopefully by the end, we'll talk about maybe some practical ways to respond or to avoid being a part of something that may go into a riot or a violent situation. And some of that's just common sense, but other times it may be strategy, because we have to be smart. We're living in a crazy time. You may go to a PTA meeting and people start doing fisticuffs. So we got to be thoughtful that all protests and everyone attending protests may not have everything similar in mind as to how we should go about it. So I want to talk about I think, like often I do when it comes to different things, we need to have like definitions. So my question in regarding why protests turn to riots, I want to first just deal with the definition of protest. So protest usually is a publicly organized demonstration of disapproval, many times of some type of law, policy, idea, or state of affairs. So protest is actually something that is very, very, very strong in the American culture, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, a riot, and this is, I think, Webster Dictionary, is a disturbance of the peace created by an assembly acting with a common purpose and in a violent and tumultuous manner to the terror of the public. And remember, I'm talking about violence, and violence is the use of physical forces to so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. So when I ask about why do protests turn to riots, I note that the disapproval demonstration is one that is public, often organized, but it becomes potentially a riot or a common goal of doing abuse and violence when it becomes a riot. And I wanted to ask the question, why protests turn to riots? Because with different things like the Black Lives Matter movement, the January 6th insurrection, the Charlottesville riot, the Mike Brown protest, a lot of times it's not really clear, and it depends on whose side you may be on, if you believe that it was a protest, a rightful protest, or if it was a violent demonstration. And then question like, which one, if any, are the most tactfully successful? And it's interesting. I don't think it's as easy as it seems. I don't think it's easy as it may first seem. So, why do protests turn to riots? Some would say easy answer, violence attracts attention and serves as a way for angry people to purge their rage. I think, especially in the more modern protests in America, this is so accurate in why many protests turn violent. It gets attention. People are angry. It's cathartic to let go of your anger, to let it fly, if you would. And so that's an easy answer, but I do think it is more complicated when we look at why protest turns to riots. I wanted to share just a few thoughts as we go, because I want to go over some points about what I believe is why protests turn to riots. And hopefully from that we can extrapolate some reasonableness as to how to avoid that if that's not our goal. Um, but as I start, I just wanted to note that a scripture that's very dear to me is Psalms 11:5. And it's one of my guiding scriptures for this whole presentation. And it goes like this: The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion. The wicked, those who love violence, God hates with a passion. And so, if we as America have an unchecked appetite for violence, then what is feeding that desire, that love for it? Because actually, God opposes that. He hates that. So, I just want to note that for free, as my old pastor used to say, I'll give you that for free. So that's what causes me to be inspired to look at this argument, why protest turns to riots. So what we have basically is a situation where in this political environment we are really dealing with a lot of riots. Would you say that's fair? Riots are significant on this political landscape, and in the past year or two, riots are demonstrated and dominating in headlines. They spark national debates and change political conversations. And amidst what some people consider the deterioration of the American democracy, um, and many asking how social movements can change institutions, businesses, law, it is critically important to talk about how these riots versus peaceful protests impact our nation, and in accurate and appropriate terms, because even though I just gave you an easy answer, it's much more difficult, especially when you consider what tactics may work and which do not. So, as I shared before, riot generally refers to a violent protest, and protests which participants are using or threatening physical force or damage to property. Arson, looting, literally combat hand to hand or with arms. But I do want to make sure we stay on task of basically peaceful protests versus violent protests or riots, because sometimes when discussing this, the question sort of tries to equate itself or interchange with other forms of political violence like armed warfare. That is not what we're talking about. I'm literally talking about more so like the insurrectionists, which was really an act of war in a lot of ways. But there will be those who argue that it wasn't armed warfare. And that's sort of where I'm going with sort of the limitation of this discussion. Now, it's important to understand that protests, like firearm possession, is a amendment right that we have constitutionally. Is protected by the First Amendment. Literally, we have the right to lawful assembly, and we can have peaceful protests. Now, the Supreme Court has established that governments may limit protests through what are called time, place, and manner restrictions, provided that the restrictions are the restrictions content and viewpoint are neutral, not supposed to take a side. It should be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interests like public safety, and formulated to allow demonstrators ample alternative channels by which to communicate their message. That's why you will see even some of the most considerably liberal cities allowing for maybe unpopular protesters like the Ku Klux Klan or white ring white nationalism, because the goal of this First Amendment right is not to decide if people have the right to have that message out there or to protest or assembly, is to make sure that public safety is considered. So we have that right. We have that right. But what we don't have a right is to violent protest. And so we have so many great examples of peaceful protest that's been successful. Now, I bet you can guess which ones often hit that standard. Yes, Mahatma Gandhi and his protests in India, his peaceful protests, which actually inspired his work in the 1930s, inspired Dr. Martin Luther King and his pushing for nonviolent protests for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Now, these things were considered successful because they changed institutions. They changed how the country was governed. It also was considered successful because it was, whether it's a political minority or racial minority, it was those in less power. They were granted access in a way that had not been achieved prior to what they did. Now, here's the the I guess the harsh truth. It came from people who, I believe, character and nobility was more paramount. It also was slower. um, People would say we've been fighting for 400 years for justice and civil rights when it came to race or comes to race. However, from the beginning was considered the civil rights movement, which many put at the feet of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Boy Buscott. It took 13 years to get the Civil Rights Act of 1968 signed. In Mahatma Gandhi's fight using pacifism, the peaceful protest and boycott by Indian citizens in their own country, was like 40 years to gain that freedom. I think particularly Generation X that I'm a part of, millennials, as well as now Generation Z, are less likely to put in the discipline and have sort of like the moral boundaries when it comes to the pacifist and nonviolent movements of the 30s and 60s. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but we like change quickly. And there are some things that suggest that protests where violence is embraced actually has been successful. Can you believe that? We have, as an example of riot success, 2014, that August, we had the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson by an officer. Remember that? His name was Darren Wilson. At first, there was nothing done. His body stayed in the street for hours and hours and hours, and then there was nothing done. It would believe that he was just a criminal. That's what the police said. And the people start protesting in Ferguson. Remember that? In Ferguson, they start protesting and they start burning things down, and people were, you know, making threats against police. And that put political pressure on Ferguson to indict and end up putting Officer Wilson in a trial. Now, it did not result in Officer Wilson being found guilty, but it did offer success in having there be some public acknowledgement and accountability legally for what was considered wrongdoing by the police officer. So some people, and there's some argument that that was a riot that led to success. So which one is best? I would say that, maybe it's politically correct, but it does suggest that prominent research suggests that nonviolent protest does have more success and is most effective method of social movements changes to pursue causes. But I know the reality is a lot more complicated than that. It is a lot more complicated than that. So, and one of the complications is that everything that's considered a protest or unarmed protest doesn't necessarily mean that it's peaceful or that it results peacefully, because violence happen. People fight physically, may have and hurt property or people or police. I mean, we just have so many things that show that it's not often just red, white, or black and white. What is a protest that's peaceful and what is one that turns into a riot? And you'll understand a little bit more about that as I go through some maybe causes of why protests turn to riots. But we do need to understand that there is a mixed bag, and be aware of that, because many people who protest, they should want and are aiming for change. But it is arguable that riots, violent protests, lead to negative backlashes for movements at the polls. Like, there was a one recent study that simulated like counterfactual scenarios when it came to the 1968 elections, re-election of President Nixon. And there are those who argued, or election, I'm sorry, of President Nixon. There are those who argue that the riots from 68 led people in white neighborhoods to vote Republican regardless of the candidate, resulting in Richard Nixon winning the election. So it can have, it can have ramifications that for some communities may be the very least that they want. Just like there are people who thought that President Trump would possibly win the 2020 election because of the fear mongering of people who dealt with different protests, whether it's Black Lives Matters or anything else, the pandemic, that maybe it will cause people to be afraid and just rather have somebody like Trump in office than another candidate. So there were concerns. So it can be a backlash, right? Riots. It's a mixed bag. And the other part is that, apparently a very popular research statistic in 2016 election found that Black Lives Matter protests, including nonviolent and violent actions, positively mobilized Black voters to get to the polls. So that was, some would argue, a positive, successful outcome of the protests of Black Lives Matter, violent or nonviolent. But here, the thing is, it did not significantly impact white voting behavior. And so, but again, we look at things like the 1992 riots in Los Angeles, and it appeared to have basically swung the pendulum to embrace a more liberal agenda and policy support among Black and white voters. So it's a mixed bag, and there often could be a backlash that you don't want or that nobody's aiming for. So let's look at why protests turn into riots. No, so keep commenting below. I want to hear if you agree to these points or not, because I really am curious as to what you may think. So why protests turn to riots? Number one on my list is that protests often turn to riots when the protest is about some life-threatening, or in the mind of the protesters, war-worthy issue is happening. Like, say the Charlottesville riots in Virginia. I think that was 2017, where they're walking around with torch lamps saying the Jews will not replace us, and all this replacement theory. The idea that removing Confederate monuments was an attempt to replace white people, white history, white impact. And even though no one was going to die whether a monument was moved or not, these people felt that it was threatening their way of life, that it was threatening their existing, the browning of America. So there are people, like, you're protesting someone threatening your way of life, and you're using torches, and people are having guns outwardly on their backs. Like, is it more likely than not that particular protest is going to turn into a riot? Is it going to turn into a riot? Is it really outside the scope of belief, or is it outside the scope of belief that someone would take the opportunity as they see counter protesters and run their vehicle through them, and then we end up with someone dying? So let's just be honest, like, if the issue is considered war worthy or life threatening, I believe it has a greater um, likelihood of becoming becoming violent. And then I think about even the January 6th riots at the Capitol. If you really believe the big lie, if you really believe that your candidate, or any candidate, but particularly your candidate, was defrauded out of winning the election as president, and you felt that it was happening in multiple states, would it really be a far crazy idea that you feel that that's war worthy? So you're going to show up what? Ready to battle, ready to take it by force if you feel like people are giving you something by force. So let's just be honest. Like, if you're protesting, you know, some retail outlet of having advertisement of baby clothes showing like a little black boy in an outfit for a monkey, I don't necessarily think that that protest against that retail establishment would necessarily turn violent. But if you think that immigrants are coming across the border and killing innocent white people, and giving drugs and killing our people on fentanyl, you may be more likely in a protest against immigration to come with violence. So number two, and I'm not going to spend as much time as I did on that one point, but I think that's a really big one. The bigger the consequences, or the greater it seems that this is a war-worthy issue, a life-threatening issue, the more likely it will be turning violent, if not violent already. Number two, why do protests turn violent? Violence ignited the protest. Often in the case, especially as we see with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests and different things, if violence ignited the protests, like this officer killed an unarmed Black person and it seemed like it was not justified, then the response is to a violent act. So for many, it is hard to respond likewise without reflecting the same violence that they believed happened, even if they didn't begin with that. But it is the idea that violence ignited the reason why I'm out. I'm angry. So me becoming violent back in my protest, whether it's looting, hitting police, whatever, then often that's sort of like the justification. Number three, unfair violent treatment of protesters. The unfair violent treatment of protesters, and I'm going to say by authorities in this case. This is what I'm talking about, by authorities. When you have a peaceful protest and you're protesting something you feel is worthy, you feel like is unjust, and then you yourself or the group collectively is being tear gassed, is being hit by rubber bullets, more likely than not, the response will be one of violence and damage. It may not be that this person or this group go after the police, but it may be, I'm going to burn the neighborhood down. It just, violence begets violence. That's why God hates it. Those who love violence, there's something wrong, because that actually goes against the creation of God. It creates damage and injury. So when protesters who are trying to be nonviolent, they feel like they're being treated unfairly or violently themselves, it's harder, especially I believe, going to one of the next point, is much harder for them to continue to remain peaceful. Number four, I believe protests can turn violent easily when it's disorganized. Even in Gandhi's time, but let me deal with what we often hold as a gold standard, the civil rights movement. They were organized. Very rarely was a march just done a protest march just done haphazardly. In fact, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian um, or the SCLC and SNCC, they would sometimes be criticized because they would not necessarily jump just with anger on every request to have a protest. Their goal was to determine where, how should it be, what are the practical considerations, how do we make sure we feed the protesters, what if they lose their job, what and how can this create change, what's our demand once the institutions turn to us. In the Montgomery bus boycott, what's our demand? There were several different tactical ways and organizations that came together to keep not only the protests hot and moving, but that organization also helped it stay and remain peaceful. I'm always amazed that even with the sit-in lunch counters and the summer bus the summer bus rides, was the freedom summer rides, that the freedom riders, that they were trained and prepared as to how to respond when you're called names, when you're hit, when they throw things at you, when they pour ketchup over your head. They had to train themselves to not respond violently. That takes discipline, and I dare say it takes spiritual maturity. And I'm actually very convinced that the civil rights movement was successful 80% of the time, where prayer and fasting was implicated, because it took a stronger disposition of spirit than it did your mind or what your earth, that it did your flesh and your body. You had to be okay with it. And when you think about that, that's why there are people who could call Selma March a riot, not because the people protesting got violent, the people on the horses got violent, but that was organized. And there were people who got permits and went to the court. It just wasn't just some haphazard walk with a mob because you're angry. So I believe that organization for peaceful protests, like location, permits, even abiding by curfews, or why I would say, especially during the Michael Brown riots, I was like, stop protesting at night. Why do you have to still be out in the street at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, or 12 o'clock at night? The darker it gets, the more mayhem can happen, and the less accountability, because it's at night. It's just more dangerous. And if you are a believer like I am regarding there's different seasons of the, or there's different time lapses of the day where there's different type of spiritual activity, anyone knows that that could be a really big mayhem hour. So if you're not organized, like we're protesting at this time, we're ending at this time, when we end, everyone goes home, no one stays meandering, the less likely it would miss those boundaries. Number 5, another reason why many protests can turn violent, there's a lack of clear goals by protesters. Besides expressing anger and discontent, this can really merge with the last point, but what's your goal? Your goal in protesting Michael Brown's killing, at the time that the protests started happening, it went into mayhem. But then you can look at other situations in cities, very few, but some cities where it's like, okay, a police officer wrongfully kills a unarmed Black person, and they're like, we're asking for, like in the Breonna case in Tennessee, they were asking for the no-knock warrant to be discontinued and prohibited, because if you remember, she was asleep in her home. They served the warrant on the wrong home and bust in the home, and her boyfriend, who had a legal right to carry, just heard people bust in the home and exchange gunfire, and she died. So, and there's argument as to if they got a no-knock warrant, so they didn't have to announce police. And so a part of the strategy, right, clear goals, was not just in the street yelling, but we want the no-knock warrant, to be discontinued. We want the police to be indicted. We want further investigation. And so those kind of goals helps keep people mindful of what you want. How are you honoring the death of this young woman by, potentially looting or hurting the police? You want to stay focused. So I think a lack of clear goals also can cause people to shift from peaceful protests to violence. Mission creep, divisions within the protest. So we are looking at, say, in the Black Lives Matter movement that expanded the world, not necessarily the looting and the violence, but just the cause. In fact, 93% of Black Lives Matter protests were nonviolent, did not deteriorate into violence. But in the cases that possibly could, there were people, say, in Seattle, Washington, in California, all over, where you had people who are not associated with the Black Lives Matter organization. They were just promoting, like, Black people's lives are valuable. And then there were people who got into the march who were Antifa, or they had they were anti-capitalist or anarchists, and they were just wanting an opportunity under the guise, or maybe they were like, yes, this particular police brutality situation we support, but they got their own mission going on. So they promote outwardly, or they seem to join into the mission that the protest is about, but they have their own division. They have their own ideas and thoughts as to what they want to happen. And that also helps protests turn violent. And it makes me so sad when I see protests that have been going on for days or hours, and it was totally fine, and majority of the people leave, and it's the few stragglers at the end that starts burning stuff, starts, creating a violent situation. Those people, I think, are mission creepers. Number 7, the failures of other protests, I believe, can cause protesters to basically get to the end of themselves and say, we've tried all this stuff. We've tried the strikes. If you're, a labor dispute or protest, we've tried the boycotts. We're trying peaceful demonstration. That's not working. So we're going to get violent, especially if some of these other factors are in existence. That I believe can suggest that it will turn violent. And I think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quote that riot is the language of the unheard. So if boycotts, strikes, petitions, television interviews, peaceful demonstrations don't work, that those who justify, like, well, we might as well, we ain't got nothing to lose. You're not listening to us. And my last few points, and I only have 10, so we're almost there. The identity of the protesters. Often to decide how protests turn violent, it definitely matters who is protesting and what. Who's protesting and why. For example, 90% of Americans oppose the Capitol riot on January 6th, according to a lot of statistics. And if it's not 90%, a huge majority. But in June the year before, it shows that 54% of Americans thought the burning of the Minneapolis police station was a justified response to the police murder of George Floyd. So what was the difference? Some people say that because both events involved destruction of property and fights with the police, was that, they were probably on even keel. And even some Republicans argue that, and then Democrats sometimes suggest that public support or antipathy was driven less by the tactics than by the identity, social position, and political orientation of the protesters. So majority of the country felt that the riots at the Capitol were not justified. And 54% thought that it was justified burning down police station. I don't think it's So here it is, we have identity politics where there are those who can suggest that the riot wasn't justified because maybe of the lack of constitutionality of the action, there was more war. Some would say the people who were fighting were also a part of what may be considered the power majority. So there may be less sympathy towards, white men fighting or creating a protest. And there are those who says when it comes to racial injustice, they are the unheard. And even though it's a very small majority in compared to what it could have been, 54% of Americans feeling it was justified, the burning down of the police station because of the murder of George Floyd, then it just shows you that, again, identities or social positions, there are people like Black people have taken enough. This is horrible what happened. The people in power were the police station and they were hurting a person that was not in power, George Floyd, and that it was either deserving or they felt it was justified, right? They didn't want it necessarily, but they find it was justified. And here's the truth. With their increased nonviolent protests, the increase of peaceful demonstrations, the increase of people getting out like, we don't like what you did, so we're going to get out there, the more opportunities it is to devolve or to turn into a riot. And even like extreme protest actions like disruptive nonviolent actions like blocking traffic, coming, enabling, shutting down buildings, institution, like in Michigan. People, although they did have arms, I understand it did not turn violent, but they're coming in. Well, actually, that was violent because they said they wanted the Michigan governor, I believe. But these type of things that draw attention to issues, but it also can reduce popular support depending on who it is. And that may be, again, a backlash and may not get people to what their goals are. So it's very important to look at who are the protesters? Who are we thinking the protesters are? And so then my last is the intent of the protesters. Let's face it, many of these, well, I'm so sorry. I skipped. Presence of counter protesters. We'll go back. The presence of counter protesters. So, say the protest against a retail outlet that showed a little Black boy and in an outfit that has or is identified as a monkey outfit. They had protests. There were not any public protesters out there saying, no, little Black boy is a monkey. So you would imagine that without that confrontation from counter protesters, it more likely could stay peaceful. But we see in Charlottesville, we see in Unite the Right, like having counter protesters increase the volatility of that particular protest. With the abortion crisis, or let's say the abortion, how do I say it? Historically, over the last 50 years, the Roe v. Wade law or Roe v. Wade decision that stood, and you had a bunch of pro-lifers fight against pro-choicers, or say pro-lifers outside of an abortion clinic, there would be more likelihood, it doesn't mean it would, for it to turn violent and disruptive. In fact, my heart breaks that especially in the 90s and early 2000s, we had people who would kill doctors and blow up clinics because they were against abortion. And so the presence of protesters would also increase the likelihood of it becoming violent. Because if you're just out there complaining alone and there's nobody there complaining against you, you may not be confronted in a way that escalates. And I guess in a lot of the police brutality protests, the people who are considered counter protests are usually the legion of police officers who show up and try to back the group up or to stop them or to shut them down. And so they're the de facto counter protesters. So where there's no counter protesters, typically we don't have a protest to devolve into a riot. So going now to number 10, the intent of the protesters. Let's just be honest that there are many so-called peaceful protests. The protesters are intending to get down with the violence. I think January 6th insurrection showed that there are people who had bear spray, ties, those plastic ties to take people captive. There were officers who saw guns, had, knives, different things. They were, and even if they didn't have, even if a majority of them, which I'm not sure is the truth, had no weapons at all, they were going to push damage, and that's violence, into the Capitol to stop the electoral college vote. They intended for it to be violent. And with more of the January 6th hearing, it is more and more obvious that they were encouraged to do that. So when the protesters intend on being violent, Unite the Right in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, they intended to be violent. And here's the truth. I believe that a lot of people want or expect some type of civil war number 2, whether it's over race, abortion, white nationalism. It's sad to say when we're talking about civil war, typically people are talking about race and things like that, but it could be just cultural. But there's nothing that seems to get people as heated as about race, abortion, gay rights, gay marriage. And so there are protesters who come intending to be violent. Now, I go over these things not because I hope that they happen, but I do think that there are some practical things to consider, especially when you yourself want to participate in a protest and you don't want to participate in a riot. So I say, first, if you're a believer, then you should be prayerful about all things. I remember that my mother told me the story about her father not wanting her to be a part of the nonviolent civil rights movement marches and protests because he didn't want her to be arrested. And she was like, I'm not going to come and get you. So she would hide. I mean, I don't have those kind of practical, and I don't believe there he was thinking that it would turn violent as much as you can get arrested. But be mindful and prayerful. These points that I made about protests that can turn violent, when you're interested in going to a protest, you need to ask yourself, who is in charge? Who is organizing it? Is it an organization I can back? Is it an organization that has had other non-violent protests that have gone well? What am I asking to do? What am I asking to help push? What is the aim? Or I'm just here yelling and angry. Where is this protest? What time of day is a protest taking place? Why would I have any business being, I'm going to get off of work and go to the late night hour, 10 o'clock in the darkness? Those practical things. And I'm telling you, like, when I was in Atlanta and I attended Spelman College, that was the fall after the Rodney King verdict. And there were protests. There were protests of a lot of AUC, Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta students in the streets. And I was like, oh my God, that's so exciting. I want to be a part of it. And so I was really looking forward to being a part of protest culture. And I participated in certain protests, walking down the street. But people like my dad and other people with wisdom are like, is there other ways you can support this event, especially when you don't know who is organizing it, you don't feel comfortable with where it is, and especially if, say, why am I going to join this protest if the night before it turned into looting or people were out of control? And so I just think wisdom can help us not be a part of the protest turning into something that you don't want to identify with, because I do believe that the most successful protests are non-violent. But I understand it's a mixed bag, and that in the sense that sometimes the violence is what gets the attention. But I think overall, in America, we have the right and the freedom to protest, to assembly. We have the right to the press. We have a right to speak truth to power, and we should use it. And I believe, as believers, we have the added protection and discernment as people of God, like the people in the civil rights movement who would pray and fast. That you understand the weapons of your warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds, and understand that your fight is not against flesh and blood only, or against them primarily. It's against principalities, evil in dark places. So one of the ways that you can avoid finding yourself in something you feel that's evil, that God hates, that turns into violence, is to understand that you may be against police brutality. You may be against cheating in elections, if that's what you feel. If you may be against this situation that's against the rights of women or whatever. But if you go in there with just anger and flesh, violence begets violence. It's not unusual for your anger and flesh to turn into violence and rage, and uncontrollable behavior. So this is my last of this chapter of dealing with America's appetite for violence. I pray and hope that it is a conversation that people are having amongst themselves, whether it's the insurrectionist hearings or some of the violence that has spun from the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I mean, I understood, and I can't remember the name of the church, but there's some Catholic church apparently that's been burned down from pro-choice protesters. So the world is on fire. It not just started with this situation, but there are going to be opportunities in the near future, if not in this moment, to decide if you're going to protest, and if you do, are you going to be peaceful, or are you going to allow it, be open to it becoming violent? And I hope and pray that it is the fact that you'll do it non-peacefully, and be very mindful of the protests you join, and also practically be mindful how you're going to get yourself out if it turn left, because we can't always control that. Another practical thing is try to go with a buddy, so that there's someone else who's looking out for you and often can help you navigate if something goes wrong. And when you go out to protest, just like with the Arab Spring, and I think that started in 2011. It started with a student setting themselves on fire because of the injustice of their country's laws. Like, understand, if you get out there and protest, especially where violence was igniting the protest, or there's something that you feel is life-threatening or war-worthy, be prepared that you might meet violence, or you may be violated yourself. It's no joke. It is no joke. It is no joke. Thank you so much for joining Hope More during the month of June. I look forward to July. We're going to be talking about a whole nother topic. I'll be bringing back a number of guest interviews, and also just working on, I won't even say a lighter note. I can't promise it's going to be a lighter note. This may be hot topic summer, not hot girl summer, because we're in the midst of a huge shift in our country for so many reasons. So my desire is to give people a little bit of hope that more is possible, more understanding, more strides towards justice, more options to consider non-violent ways of handling stuff, and reconsidering the things that may cause violence or be a topic of violence. Do we have to really go there? Is it successful? Why do we do it? And not be afraid to ask the foundational questions and listen to what possible answers may be. So thank you so much for being on Hope More. I love you so much, and I mean it. And I'll see you next Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, on the Hope More, lowercase HOPE, uppercase MORE, on Facebook, or the Hope More, lowercase HOPE, uppercase MORE YouTube channel. I love you so much. God bless you. And God bless America. We need it. Bye-bye.